Loving God, we come to you with gratitude for this opportunity to come together as your people and to learn the history more deeply of the Kingdom of Hawaii, of the church in Hawaii, and of the land. We give thanks for Dr. Keanu Sai, and we give thanks for all who are here today. We pray that our ears, as well as our minds and our hearts, will be open, and that we will allow ourselves to consider new facts we may hear and to approach this learning with respect and openness to all. We ask this in Jesus' name, amen. All right, now, Dr. Sai, thank you for being with us again, and it's all yours.
Hello, everyone. My name is Keanu. This is my second presentation of 4 for this month. I really appreciate the opportunity that the UCC provided for myself and 2 other academics that will follow me in presenting Hawaii's history. I am a faculty member at the University of Hawaii. At Windward Community College, I teach political science as well as Hawaiian studies. And I also am affiliate faculty member in the graduate program in the College of Education. I actually teach courses on this subject, the Hawaiian Kingdom, and the title of my course at the graduate level is Introduction to the Hawaiian State. Okay, my approach in everything as far as Hawaii's history is from a science of politics approach, because I'm a political scientist. I don't have a Hawaiian studies background, but the subject of my research focuses on Hawaii's history and naturally delves into what people may think is Hawaiian studies. Hawaiian studies, it's multidisciplinary. My area is political science. I specialize in international relations and law. That's pretty much my area. So this past presentation, we covered how terminology is so important, really important, because words have meaning and these meanings have consequences. And it's not a matter of semantics, right? So you would never confuse kidnapping with adoption, right? Well, in this case, you wouldn't confuse occupation of a country with annexation, okay? Both are different, and the means by which it comes about are different, and both are regulated differently as far as law, okay? Now, some people say, well, you always talk about the law, Dr. Sai, and I believe in the law, right? People say, well, in international law, it may be considered illegal, but nothing has happened. Well, there's a reason for that, right? For one, we didn't know. We didn't even know that we were even occupied until research had started at the university when I returned from the Netherlands back in the year 2000. Now, when you speak of law, it's like, okay, it's illegal to overthrow a government by an unjust war, okay? Well, there is a law in America and in countries where you don't commit murder. Well, even though you have that law that says it's illegal, it doesn't stop anybody or everyone from committing murder. It gets into enforcement. And that's why international law is a different vehicle, you might say, of how you enforce the violations of international law. Now, we're going to be getting into that in the third presentation, and then pretty much a part of the fourth presentation. But what we need to understand is that when a country is occupied, anywhere in the world, militarily occupied, called belligerent occupation, the occupier is obligated to administer the laws of the occupied state. That's important, right? So the question would be, well, what are the laws of the occupied state? Because international law, its job is to, as far as occupation, is to maintain the status quo of the occupied state, its institutions, its laws, its population, its territory, because occupations are supposed to be temporary, right? Well, how did ours last over a century? Well, we're going to be getting into that next presentation because there is a reason why. And in a nutshell, it's called denationalization. Children throughout the schools, which began at my tutu's generation, my grandparents' generation, we're basically brainwashed into believing something that's not true. And by the time you get that information to my parents' generation, when he was at St. Louis, my dad graduated in 1939. Oh, sorry, he was born in 1939. That information is already institutionalized. And I can tell you, by the time I got to myself, when I was at the Kamehameha schools, when I graduated in 1982, out of sight, out of mind, I didn't know anything, right? So it's important that we begin to recover our memory, right? Not to pick a side, just recover our memory. So if the law of occupation says it must administer, the occupier must administer the laws of the occupied state, it begs the question, well, what are those laws? How do they apply, right? And a lot of us tend to assume we know about how the Hawaiian Kingdom operated. Well, in fact, a lot of that contemporary scholarship has been debunked, namely that the missionaries were in control of the Hawaiian Kingdom, right? Kamehameha III was controlled by a missionary element. All of that has been disproven, okay? And the idea that the American missionary, on behalf of the United States, controlled the Hawaiian Kingdom begs the question, why did the United States overthrow the government of the Hawaiian Kingdom if you were already in control? You don't overthrow something that you're in control of. Now, once you're in control, that's when you start to see the controlling take place. The control of the economy, the control of education, the control of the narrative, right? So this presentation today is going to focus on the constitutional history of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And it's going to begin with Kamehameha I. Okay, so with that, why don't we begin? My presentation should last just over half an hour. And then Cassie is going to be taking questions. Okay, here we go. Okay, so the constitutional history of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Now in 1794, Hawaii became a British protectorate by agreement between Captain Vancouver and King Kamehameha I. And the British ensign, here's what it looked like in 1794, was the flag of the Kingdom of Hawaii. And that's important to note, the Kingdom of Hawaii, because that Kingdom of Hawaii as a term will evolve into the Kingdom of the Sandwich Islands, to the Kingdom of the Hawaiian Islands, to the Hawaiian Kingdom by 1893. Now in 1816, Kamehameha I ordered the formation of the Hawaiian flag, and that is the flag of the Hawaiian Kingdom. So that's the reason why the Union Jack is there. Not that Hawaii was a colony of the British. Actually, Kamehameha was part of the British Empire. In April 1810, Keanu Sai, son of Ka'eo and king of Kauai, recognizes Kamehameha as his superior and is able to retain his reign over Kauai as what would be known as a vassal state. Kamehameha formed the Kingdom of the Sandwich Islands that ruled over the former kingdoms of Hawaii, Maui, Oahu, and Kauai. Kamehameha was thereafter known as King of the Sandwich Islands. So here we have, at the time of Kalani Kupule, and that Oahu had already been acquired by Kahekili from Kahahana, who was the king of Oahu, consolidated Oahu under the Kingdom of Maui, where you had three separate kingdoms that existed in 1783. The Kingdom of Hawaii, Hawaii Island, and that was headed by Kamehameha I. The Kingdom of Maui, Kalani Kupule, the son of Kahekili, and Keanu, the son of Ka'eo. Now, after the Battle of Nu'uanu in 1795, the Kingdom of Maui was consolidated within the Kingdom of Hawaii. And it was then called the Kingdom of the Sandwich Islands. Eventually, the Kingdom of the Sandwich Islands included by 1810, Kauai and Ni'ihau. Now on May 4th, 1825, His British Majesty's ship Blonde, under the command of Lord Byron, arrived in Lahaina from London with the bodies of King Kamehameha II and Queen Kamamalu. In the hands of Lord Byron were secret instructions from the British Crown regarding the Sandwich Islands government and actions to be taken with foreign powers if they exerted sovereignty over the islands. The instructions in part stated, you will endeavor to cultivate a good understanding with the government in whatever native hands it may be, and to secure by kind offices and friendly intercourse a future and lasting protection for the persons and property of the subjects of the United Kingdom. As my lords have directed that you should be furnished with the voyages of Captain Cook and Vancouver and that of Captain Kotzebue of the Russian Navy, and an essay on the commerce of the Pacific by Captain Mackany, I can't pronounce that, you will be apprised of the position in which these islands stand with regard to the Crown of Great Britain, and that His Majesty might claim over them a right of sovereignty not only by discovery, but by a direct and formal cession by the natives, by the way it was Kamehameha I and his chiefs, and by the virtual acknowledgement of the officers of foreign powers. His Majesty's rights you will, if necessary, be prepared to assert, but considering the distance of the place and the infant state of political society there, you will avoid, as far as possible, the bringing these rights into discussion, and will propose that any disputed point between yourself and any subjects of other powers shall be referred to your respective governments. Now, on June 16, 1824, while Lord Byron was here, the Council of Chiefs confirmed Kamehameha II's younger brother, Kawikiauli, to be Kamehameha III. But since the young king was only 11 years old, Ka'ahumanu remained regent, which serves in the absence of the monarch. In the meeting, Kalani Moku pointed out defects in the laws, especially in regard to the reversion of lands upon the death of a king. The council agreed to forego the reversion, and the lands remain in the chiefs or the successors, except in times of treason. Lord Byron then submitted 8 recommendations to the Council of Chiefs: that the king be head of the people, that all the chiefs swear allegiance, that all the lands descend in hereditary succession, that taxes be established to support the king, that no man's life be taken except by consent of the king or regent and 12 chiefs, that the king or regent grant pardons at all times, that all the people be free and not bound to one chief, that a port duty be laid on all foreign vessels. The system of government that existed at this time was very much fragmented under what may be considered somewhat of a federation, right? At the top, you had Kamehameha, right? In this case, Kamehameha III, but under him, you had in the different moku, different chiefs that ran their moku, right? And a person who may have been found to have violated a particular law in one moku by the chief, he could actually move to another moku, and that chief won't recognize that violation. So what you had was a decentralized, in a way, feudal system. In the Hawaiian language, that feudal system is referred to as ali'iana, or chiefing, right? What they're doing here is beginning to consolidate multi-levels of governance into one, and this was the beginning. And Great Britain came from a feudal system, so it's speaking from experience. On December 7, 1827, Kahumanu called a meeting with the Council of Chiefs to discuss Kamehameha's cession of the islands to Great Britain and to discuss a code of laws for the kingdom. The chiefs understood the British relationship to be comity rather than vassalage, and therefore the Council of Chiefs could make the code of laws without British approval. On December 8, 1827, was the first penal or criminal code that prohibited murder, theft, adultery, selling of rum, prostitution, and gambling. This was the first penal code that applied equally across all the islands, and not just in one particular moku or mokupuni or island. At a meeting of the Council of Chiefs in 1829, Captain Finch of the USS Vincennes heard for the first time the use of the English word Hawaiian. He wrote that the government and natives generally have dropped or do not admit the designation of Sandwich Islands as applied to their possessions, but adopt and use that of Hawaiian, in allusion to the fact of the whole group having been subjugated by the first Kamehameha, who was the chief of the principal island of Oahe, or more modernly, Hawaii. Now, Captain Cook named the group of islands that comprised 3 separate kingdoms the Sandwich Islands, after the Earl of Sandwich. Well, in 1829, as noted by the officer from the USS Vincennes, the chiefs renamed it to Hawaiian Islands, which in the native language is Ko Hawaii Pai Aina. And it's important to know exactly the translation here. Ko Hawaii Pai Aina is literally the islands that belong to Hawaii, referring to Kamehameha's kingdom of Hawaii, as opposed to the kingdom of Maui or Kauai. If Kalani Kupule consolidated these islands, it would not be called the Hawaiian Kingdom. It would probably be called the Mauian Kingdom, right? Now, upon the death of Kahumanu in 1832, Kamehameha III assumed full control of government and appointed Kinau as premier. In 1834, a more expansive code was enacted with 5 chapters, and each chapter was discussed and ratified by the Council of Chiefs according to ancient custom before receiving the king's signature and becoming law. In the kingdom, religion was as much a part of chiefly governance as governance was an extension of religion. When a Catholic missionary party arrived in Honolulu in 1827, they did not request a license or permission, as did the Protestant missionary party in 1820. Since January 3rd, 1830, the Catholic religion was banned by Kahumanu as premier. On September 30th, 1836, after another Catholic priest arrived, Kamehameha III issued an ordinance rejecting the Catholic religion on December 18, 1837. Pursuant to the ordinance, followers of the Catholic religion were persecuted and imprisoned. However, on June 17, 1839, Kamehameha III issued orders that no more punishments should be inflicted and that all who were then in confinement should be released. Now, these people were not chiefs, but commoners. Hearing of the persecution, a French warship commanded by Captain Laplace arrived in Honolulu on July 9, 1839. Captain Laplace was prepared to carry out hostilities if the Catholic religion was not allowed to be practiced in the kingdom. In addition to allowing the practice of the Catholic faith, Kamehameha III was compelled to sign an unequal treaty with the French captain that imposed jury selection benefits to Frenchmen and a fixed duty on French wine or brandy not exceeding 5% ad valorem. On October 26, 1839, the American Council sent a letter to Kamehameha III regarding the American missionaries and government. He wrote, "Sir, as the opinion seems to be to some extent entertained that American citizens residing in the Sandwich Islands as missionaries under the patronage of an incorporated institution in the United States have exerted a controlling influence upon the framers of the laws of this country, I have very respectfully to inquire if they have ever had any voice in the passage of laws affecting the interests of other foreigners, and particularly whether they have ever had anything to do in the measures adopted by your government for the prevention of the introduction of the Catholic religion into the country." Well, 2 days later, on October 28th, Kamehameha III responded, "My respects to you, the American Consul. I have received your letter asking questions respecting the American missionaries, supposed by some to regulate the acts of my government under me. I, together with the chiefs under me, now clearly declare to you that we do not see anything in which your questions are applicable to the American missionaries. From the time the missionaries first arrived, they have asked liberty or permission to dwell in these islands. Communicating instructions in letters and delivering the word of God has been their business. They were hesitatingly permitted to remain by the chiefs of that time because they were said to be about to take away the country. We exercised forbearance, however, and protected all the missionaries. And as they frequently arrived in this country, we permitted them to remain in this kingdom because they asked it. And when we saw the excellence of their labors, then some of the chiefs and people turned to them in order to be instructed in letters, for those things were, in our opinion, really true. When the priests of the Romish religion landed at these islands, they did not first make known to us their desire to dwell on the islands, and also their business. There was not a clear understanding with this company of priests as there was that, because they landed in the country secretly without Kahumanu's hearing anything about their remaining here. But that thing which you speak of to me, that they act with us or overrule our acts, we deny it. It is not so. We think that perhaps these are their real crimes. They're teaching us knowledge. They're living with us in customs translating between us and foreigners. They're not taking the sword into their hand and saying to us with power, stop, punish not the worshipers in the Romish religion. But to stand at variance with and to confine that company, they have never spoken of like that since the time of Kahumanu, down to the time that the Romish priest was confined on board the Europa. I think perhaps those things are not clear to you. It would perhaps be proper, therefore, that the American missionary should be examined before you and Commodore Reed, and us also. So he's quite blunt. He says, no, we run the country and we run our government. Although the Hawaiian Kingdom declared the Protestant faith to be the religion of the country in 1824, it learned tolerance, religious tolerance, as a result of its experience with dealing with Catholicism, especially Captain Laplace. Government reform would include the separation of the church from government. It would also allow Hawaiian commoners to practice the old religion. A lot of people didn't know this. After being threatened with French aggression, Kamehameha III and his chiefs pursued government reform that sought to establish as well as protect the rights of its people. According to British General William Miller in 1831, if then the natives wish to retain the government of the islands in their own hands and become a nation, if they are anxious to avoid being dictated to by any foreign commanding officer that may be sent to this station, it seems to be absolutely necessary they should establish some defined form of government and a few fundamental laws that will afford security for property, and such commercial regulations as will serve for their own guidance as well as for that of foreigners. If these regulations be liberal, as they ought to be, commerce will flourish and all classes of people will be gainers. Unable to secure an instructor for the king and chiefs in government reform, William Richards accepted an appointment by Kamehameha III as the instructor, and classes were taught to the chiefs at Lahainaluna. Richards developed a curriculum based upon Hawaiian translations of Professor Francis Wayland's 2 books, Elements of Moral Science and Elements of Political Economy. Now, Richards sought to theorize governance from a foundation of natural rights within an agrarian society based upon capitalism that was not only cooperative in nature, but also morally grounded in Christian values. When you hear the word capitalism, people think that the whole world is run through capitalism as espoused by Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. Okay? That's not true, right? Capitalism is a form of an economy, right? The Hawaiian Kingdom, what's interesting is they did not accept the Wealth of Nations version, but rather Wayland's Elements of Political Economy. And that is really interesting. If there's any comparison of capitalism in the Hawaiian Kingdom, it would be the Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden. They're called mixed economies that has capitalism, but also government regulations, also referred to as a welfare state. Not that they're on welfare, but a government that looks out for the welfare of all its people, education, health, and so forth. On June 7, 1839, Kamehameha III proclaimed an expanded code of laws preceded by a Declaration of Rights. The code stated, no chief has any authority over any man any farther than it is given him by specific enactment. And no tax can be levied other than that which is specified in the printed law. And no chief can act as a judge in a case where he is personally interested. And no man can be dispossessed of land which he has put under cultivation except for crimes specified by law. What you're seeing here is a natural evolution, timing of transforming absolute rule, okay, through a feudal system into a constitutional system. The following year, on October 8, 1840, Kamehameha III signed into law the first constitution incorporating the Declaration of Rights as its preamble. The function of the Constitution was to lay down the general features of a system of government and to define to a greater or less extent the powers of such government in relation to the rights of persons on the one hand, and on the other in relation to certain other political entities, which are incorporated in the system. As a result of the temporary occupation by the French in 1839, British policy toward the kingdom as a protectorate would change. Lord Ingester, a member of the British House of Commons, called upon the Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs, Viscount Palmerston, to respond. Palmerston was non-committal, but it signaled a change in policy that would be taken up by his successor, Lord Aberdeen. The British Admiralty put out in 1842, Lord Aberdeen does not think it advantageous or politique to seek to establish a paramount influence for Great Britain in those islands at the expense of that enjoyed by other powers. All that appears to his lordship to be required is that no other power should exercise a greater degree of influence than that possessed by Great Britain. This is what prompted Kamehameha III, okay, to now pursue the recognition of Hawaiian independence without violating any type of allegiance, or fealty to the British Crown as a protectorate. So in 1842, Kamehameha III pursued the formal recognition of Hawaiian state sovereignty. To accomplish this, he appointed Timoteo Ha'alilio, William Richards, and Sir George Simpson. While the envoys were on their diplomatic mission, Lord Paulet of the British Navy seized control of the government and occupied the Hawaiian Kingdom on February 25th, 1843. He justified the seizure of the Hawaiian government because they weren't acting British, right? So he decides to take them over. Word of the occupation reached British Admiral Thomas in Valparaiso in Chile, and he arrived in the islands on July 25th, 1843. After a meeting with King Kamehameha III, the Hawaiian government was restored on July 31st, 1843, which has come to be known as the national holiday of Restoration Day, La Ho'ihoi. At a Thanksgiving service, after the ceremony, Kamehameha III declared, "Ua mau ke ea o ka aina I ka pono." The life of the land is perpetuated in righteousness. This was later followed on November 28th, 1843, by joint proclamation from the British and the French, recognizing the Hawaiian Kingdom as an independent state. This day, November 28th, is a national holiday of Independence Day, or La Ku'oko'a. And this was followed the following year, formal recognition by the United States on July 6th, in a letter by Secretary of State John C. Calhoun on behalf of President John Tyler, that the president recognizes the independence of the Hawaiian government. On October 29th, 1845, Kamehameha III commissioned Robert Wiley of Scotland to be Minister of Foreign Affairs, Gerrit Judd, a former missionary, as Minister of Finance, William Richards, also a former missionary, as Minister of Education, and John Ricord, an American citizen, as Attorney General. All rescinded their former nationality except for Wiley, being British, became a dual citizen as what was called a Hawaiian denizen. And the reason why Wiley was not able to rescind his British nationality because British law says you can't. Once a British, always British. But he was able to acquire Hawaiian citizenship by being a dual citizen. The others became Hawaiian subjects prior to the appointments. Now this stirred some concern amongst the people, and Kamehameha responded to those concerns in the newspaper. He wrote, "The people who have learned the new ways I have retained." Here is the name of one of them, Kapiao, Secretary of the Treasury. He understands the work very well, and I wish there were more such men. Among the chiefs, Leleohoku, Paki, and John Young, which is Keoneana, the son of John Young Olohana, are capable of filling such places, and they already have government offices, one of them over foreign officials. And as soon as the young chiefs are sufficiently trained, I hope to give them the places, but they are not now able to become speakers in foreign tongues. I have therefore refused the letters of appeal to dismiss the foreign advisors for those who speak only the Hawaiian tongue. John Record once told Samuel Kamakau, who would become a legislator as well as a renowned historian, "The laws of Rome, that government from which all other governments of Europe, Western Asia, and Africa descended, could not be used for Hawaii, nor could those of England, France, or any other country. The Hawaiian people must have laws adapted to their mode of living. But it is right to study the laws of other peoples, and fitting that those who conduct law offices in Hawaii should understand these other laws and compare them to see which are adapted to our way of living and which are not." The theory of constitutional monarchy states that the three powers of modern constitutional monarchy have distinct functions, but are not completely separate. This is the legislative, executive, and judicial. As part of an interdependent whole, each power is defined not only by its own particular function, but also by the other powers which limit and interact with it. In 1851, the legislature passed a resolution establishing a commission to revise the 1840 Constitution. The commission adopted the structure and organization of the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution, being the most advanced at the time in the world. The revised Constitution was approved by the legislature, and Kamehameha IV signed it into law on June 14, 1852. Sorry, that should be Kamehameha III, not IV. Now, remnants, however, of absolute rule remained in the Constitution in order to protect the kingdom from any future foreign aggression based upon Hawaiian experience. In particular, Article 39 says, "The king, by and with the approval of his cabinet and privy council, in case of invasion or rebellion, can place the whole kingdom or any part of it under martial law, and he can ever alienate it, if indispensable, to free it from the insult and oppression of any foreign power." And Article 45 says, "All important business for the kingdom which the king chooses to transact in person, he may do, but not without the approbation of the Kuhina Nui or premier. The king and the premier shall have a negative on each other." Article 45 allows the king to do things without legislative approval, so long as he has approval from the premier or the Kuhina Nui. This was for the purpose of moving quickly in time of strife. Now, since 1839, the Hawaiian Kingdom was on a tenuous relation with France. On March 21st, 1846, Rear Admiral Hamlin arrived in Honolulu and returned the 4 boxes containing $20,000 that was paid to Captain Laplace as a bond. However, 3 days later, Kamehameha III reluctantly signed 2 identical treaties with the British and French that reiterated the Laplace Treaty. So you can still see that Kamehameha III is still dealing with harsh diplomacy, just shy of gunboat diplomacy. In August 1849, French Consul Dillon accused the Hawaiian government of violating the 1846 treaty. These demands centered on the treatment of Catholics, the duty on liquors, and the unequal treatment of Frenchmen. Admiral de Tremblay landed an armed force in Honolulu and captured the government fort, the custom house, and other government buildings, and seized the king's yacht together with 7 merchant vessels in port. The French 10-day occupation and destruction of the fort were justified by de Tremblay by proclamation on August 30th, 1849, as France's international right of reprisal. The 2 French warships left Honolulu on September 5th, 1849, but tensions rose again with the new French consul, Louis Perrin. Because of the renewed French aggression, the king and premier were forced to consider placing the kingdom under the protection of the United States. Talks of annexation to the United States were negotiated but were not successful. With the death of Kamehameha III on December 15, 1854, well, that ended any and all talks of annexation to the United States. When Kamehameha IV ascended to the throne as the adopted son of Kamehameha III and heir apparent, he told the legislature the age of Kamehameha III was that of progress and of liberty, of schools and of civilization. He gave us a constitution and fixed laws. He secured the people in the title to their lands and removed the last chain of oppression. He gave them a voice in his councils and in the making of the laws by which they are governed. He was a great national benefactor and has left the impress of his mild and amiable disposition on the age for which he was born. Alexander Liholiho succeeded to the throne as Kamehameha IV. During his reign, the premier was separated as an office from the Minister of the Interior. Prior to this, they worked together. Department of Public Instruction was established. Legislative sessions were biennial, and he also established the Queen's Hospital along with his wife, Queen Emma. On November 30th, 1863, Kamehameha IV died. The premier, Victor Kamamalu, temporarily succeeded to the throne, as stated in the Constitution, and thereafter proclaimed Lat Kapuaiva, her brother, as Kamehameha V. Upon ascending to the throne, Kamehameha V did not take the oath of office because he did not approve the Constitution. Well, Article 94 states the king, after approving this Constitution, shall take the following oath, clearly authorizing the king to not take the oath. And these were just some of the anomalies that he and his brother were trying to deal with in amending the 1852 Constitution. Both Kamehameha IV and V felt that the 1852 Constitution had to be amended in order to move forward as a constitutional monarchy. Article 45 should be removed and leave any changes to the Constitution and laws solely with the Legislative Assembly. Article 94 should mandate the office and not make it a choice. Mandate the oath of office. And the Constitution should provide for the separation of powers doctrine. Kamehameha V seized the opportunity to make the necessary alterations when he ascended to the throne and called for a constitutional convention, first ever, of elected delegates in the kingdom. The elected delegates, nobles, and king met together in convention from July 7 to August 8, 1864, and agreed upon all the constitutional changes except for qualifications for elected representatives and those voting for the representatives. The convention was at a deadlock on these electoral provisions by the elected delegates from the people. As a result, Kamehameha V, in an act of irony, dissolved the convention and exercised his sovereign prerogative under Article 45. And he then later annulled the 1852 Constitution with the approval of the premier, who at this time was his father, Matayo Kekuanaoa. He proclaimed the new Constitution on August 20th, 1864. Along with the electoral qualifications, the office of premier was eliminated, whose check on the actions of the monarch was replaced by the signature of a cabinet minister. Unlike the premier, who was not accountable to anyone, the cabinet minister was accountable to the legislature and could be removed by a vote of lack of confidence or impeachment proceedings. The function of the Privy Council was greatly reduced, and the regency replaced the function of the premier should the monarch die. The crown was required to take the oath of office. The legislature became unicameral. They brought the House of the Nobles and the House of Representatives into one body, sitting together. And the separation of powers doctrine was fully enshrined in the Constitution. In his speech at the opening of the Legislative Assembly of 1864, Kamehameha V explained and justified his action under Article 45 of the 1852 Constitution. The 45th article, he stated, that reserved to the sovereign the right to conduct personally in cooperation with the Kohinanui or premier, but without the intervention of a ministry or the approval of the legislature, such portions of the public business as he may choose to undertake. In this case, proclaiming a new constitution. Now, the 1864 Legislative Assembly appointed a special committee to respond to Commander Fitt's opening speech of the new legislature. The committee recognized the constitutionality of his actions and stated, this prerogative, converted into a right by the terms of the 1852 Constitution, Your Majesty has now parted with both for yourself and successors, and this assembly thoroughly recognizes the sound judgment by which Your Majesty was actuated to abandon such a privilege, which at some future time might have been productive of untold evil to the nation. This clearly, without them knowing it, is bringing in the Bayonet Constitution 1887, which I'll be covering next presentation. On December 11, 1872, Kamehameha V died without naming a successor to the throne. And for the first time in Hawaiian history, the legislature would be convened to elect King William Charles Lunalilo. Lunalilo would only reign for 1 year, after which the legislature was reconvened to elect another monarch. And that was King David Kalakaua on February 12, 1874. King Lunalilo would only, Now, in 1880, you have reports that are given to the Legislative Assembly by the president of the Board of Education. In 1880, I just want to draw some attention here. Progress of the system. The system is still in a youthful condition, and many of the natural outgrowths of foreign systems have not yet been fully or successfully incorporated into it. Among these may be mentioned the systematic examination and grading of teachers, the establishment of normal schools for training teachers and of teachers' institutes, and the full and proper gradation of the pupils in the public schools. The results, however, of the past biennial period would seem to indicate the increased interest and confidence of the nation in its system of public instruction. This interest is manifested by the popular desire for schools of increased proficiency, by the acknowledgement of the superior efficiency and economy of the systems of union and graded schools, by the greater demand for well-qualified teachers, and by the desire for new and better schools houses to take the place of the old and dilapidated ones. This progress, so satisfactory to the friends of education, is evidence that the judgment of the people, harmonized with the liberal educational policy which your honorable body, the legislature, has heretofore seen fit to pursue. This harmony is essential to the success of our system of instruction, for from experience proves that liberal appropriations and legislative enactments cannot of themselves alone impart to such a system vitality. It must rely also for this upon an enlightened public opinion, itself the result of education by which the people are brought to esteem the proper training of their children as a paramount duty. And finally, just this one part of the Board of Education report, referring moral truths, which is quite interesting. One great defect of our common school teachers is the lack of inclination or ability to teach their pupils moral truths. Our public school system should, like the government which administers it, be non-sectarian and national, and the board aim to maintain it free from the influence of church and sect. This is speaking to the separation of church and state. But this should not prevent the teachers from instructing their pupils in the principles of morality and good behavior and those habits of thought which form the basis of all religious beliefs. So this is an important point to note. Okay, the government was so non-secular. They said this is affecting teaching morals to the students because the teachers didn't want to go into that. So these are examples of the Hawaiian Kingdom experiencing and trying to come up with ways to resolve situations. Between 1880 and 1892, 18 Hawaiian subjects participated in the Hawaiian Youths Abroad program, where they studied in England, Scotland, Italy, United States, China, and Japan. In England, they attended King's College and St. Chad's College. Subjects included military training, ironworks, medicine, engraving, and sculpture. Founder of modern China, Dr. Sun Yat-sen attended uokalani College and Oahu College in Honolulu. From 1879 to 1883, Dr. Sun Yat-sen is like the George Washington of China today. In 1910, while he was in Hawaii, he told a reporter, "This is my Hawaii. Here I was brought up and educated, and it was here that I came to know what modern civilized governments are like and what they mean." To bring it to a close, here's some closing statements. The Hawaiian Kingdom is a progressive country that espoused the rule of law. The Hawaiian Kingdom's literacy was second to Scotland. Aboriginal Hawaiians throughout the islands received universal health care at no charge at Queen's Hospital. And under the Kuleana Act of 1850, which has not been repealed, the commoner can purchase up to 50 acres of government land at 50 cents an acre. Well, according to the inflation calculator, 50 cents in 1850 would be $18.99 today. And with that, I'll pass it over to Cassie, and that will conclude my presentation on the constitutional history of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Sorry, just went a bit over.
Let me start with, so I know the primary elections, just the results came in last night, and I saw something like, I think 33% of registered voters voted in that election, which I thought was pretty low. I wanted to start actually with a question that we had from last week, and it said, in light of the current elections, are we supposed to vote? And if so, who should we vote for? Or does voting leave us liable for committing war crimes? So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Okay, that's pretty hard hitting off the bat.
Yeah.
Okay. So in order to answer that question, I need to refer to the law of occupation. That way it's not my personal opinion or my position statement, right? So as I stated earlier, the law of occupation is to maintain the status quo of the occupied state. Now, in particular, the institutions cannot be affected, nor its laws, okay? Now, the elections that are taking place since 1898 have all been done under American law. The problem is American law cannot be applied in a foreign country, whether it's for voting, whether it's for regulating businesses. American laws have no extraterritorial effect, no more than Hawaiian law in 1880 has no effect in the United States. Now, the only way that American law could be applied in Hawaii, which would include voting, is that you need a treaty. You need a treaty where the Hawaiian Kingdom joined the United States. We don't have a treaty. Hawaii was seized during the Spanish-American War, and the false narrative began thereafter that Hawaii became a part of the United States and it is American and you speak English. So in answer to that question, when one country imposes its laws in violation of the law of occupation, which occurred during World War I, the Allied powers came up with calling that, in particular, a war crime called usurpation of sovereignty, which is the unlawful imposition of sovereignty, including its laws, right? So in the case of World War I, you had Bulgarians imposing Bulgarian law in the Serbian state, as well as German law in the Serbian state, right? That's where that came from. So usurpation of sovereignty is a war crime, but international law itself prevents imposition of foreign law because that's why countries are called independent states. Only their laws exist over that territory, independent of other laws over other territories, which would include the United States. So because the Hawaiian government was overthrown, which we'll cover next week, Sunday, that doesn't mean the Hawaiian Kingdom and its laws was overthrown. It only obligates the United States to begin to administer the laws of the occupied state, which would include its voting laws, because the people who vote in a country are the citizenry of that country, or the people who voted in the elections currently and since 1898 were considered citizens of the United States, using United States law with which to register and submit their vote. So I hope I answered that.
Definitely no. Thank you very much for that. It was a tough three-part question there. Someone had asked, where can we find the original sources? For example, the Hawaiian Constitution.
Actually, in the library. Well, today everything is Google, and Google Books have done a tremendous job in creating PDFs, right? So you can just look it up. A good place to go would be if you go to hawaiiankingdom.org, right? It has original documents up there. So that might be a good start. Or you can just Google it yourself and see what else is there. University of Hawaii, Hamilton. Students have access to PDFs. Yeah, so it's there. They're all there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. How do you answer people who say, if not America, then it would have been another nation taking over Hawaii?
Well, if another nation took over Hawaii, they would be in the same situation as the United States as an illegal occupier. So it wouldn't change, right? It's also what I say, and I say this carefully, because I used to be a social worker at the Queen Lili Uokalani Children's Center, right? Quite some time ago. The battered wife syndrome. I'm glad I'm okay with my husband beating me because it's not another person. So it's also stemming from what would be called the Stockholm syndrome, where the kidnappers in Stockholm align themselves up by trying to justify why they're kidnapped. That is more of a psychological situation, not a legal situation. But the fact that some of us are entertaining that is an indication that we also not only have to deal with our history, but also the mental health of our people, because what happened in 1893 was traumatic. And you track that till today, it continued, where what was once thought of as a clear aggression has now been accepted as, well, I'm glad America did it and nobody else, right? Yeah.
Let's see. What can we do to get back to Hawaiian law?
Well, it's not about getting back anything. It's really just knowing what the law is. So as I'll be covering next week, the law of occupation. When a government is overthrown, that doesn't mean the country is overthrown, right? But what is tied to that country in what is called international law is called the legal system or the legal order. That remains, despite the government being overthrown. So the government has the function of creating law, executing law, judging law, right? Executive, legislative, judicial. When that government is overthrown, like any government in any country as a result of an invasion, okay, the laws have to be enforced. That's why customary international law, as it was since the mid-1800s, more in particular 1893, mandated the occupier to administer the laws of the occupied state so they become that temporary or provisional government until a treaty of peace is signed and the occupation will come to an end. In the meantime, they have to administer the laws of the occupied state. The United States did that during the Spanish-American War in 1898. Even though they overthrew Spanish governance in Cuba, the president issued an order, President Cleveland said, you must administer Spanish law until there's a treaty of peace, which took effect in 1899. So when we're talking about Hawaii, it's not trying to find the law. The laws have always been there, right? But we just have to understand how those laws were made and how they're enacted, because the Hawaiian Kingdom is a very different system of government than the United States. We today, all we know is American law, and we assume the Hawaiian Kingdom was similar to America. No, it's very different. The United States is a republic. It's non-monarchical. The Hawaiian Kingdom is not a republic. It's monarchical, but it's constitutional, limited, and progressive. So we need to understand how it worked, not just, oh, the law said this. Yeah.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Maybe we'll do one more question here. Who could vote in the Hawaiian Kingdom? And this person had asked particularly about women. Okay,
so there's an interesting note here on who can vote and vote on what, right? So whenever we think of voting, we think of suffrage, voting for an elected official, okay, and that women can't vote, okay, but that is only one aspect of voting. You can also vote if you're in the cabinet of the king. You can also vote if you're a member of the Privy Council, right? You can also vote if you're in the House of Nobles. Hawaiian women have been in these places of decision making. This was not about this being male oriented, right? It was more status, class, and women, especially Kahumanu, held the highest level. Also Lili uokalani. But you also had Konia, yeah? Konia was also a member of the House of Nobles. She voted, right, in the 1840s under the constitutional system. Now, gradually, I believe it would no doubt have led to women's suffrage for elected officials. That would be a natural extension. So it's not like in the United States where women for the first time were allowed to vote. It's really articulating what exactly is voting and who's voting on what and in what capacity. Because a vote is a position of authority, yeah, that authorizes something. Okay. Now, in the Hawaiian Kingdom, at that time, it was limited to men voting as far as for suffrage, right? And that would only be for the House of Representatives. Nobles were appointed, and they also included women, okay? Ruth Keili Kolani was a member of the House of Nobles as well, right? But the ability to vote is a person had to have Hawaiian nationality, and that would be called a Hawaiian, being a Hawaiian subject. So under Hawaiian law, there were 3 ways to acquire Hawaiian citizenship. You can be natural born on Hawaiian territory, you acquire it, okay? And that's what we call jus soli, that's a Latin term, legal term. You could apply for naturalization where there's a residency requirement and then you apply, but it's still discretionary if you're going to be granted Hawaiian citizenship. Or you can be born abroad of Hawaiian subject parents, let's say born in California, right, in 1880. That child would be an American because it's natural born, but the parents are Hawaiian subjects. That child would acquire the citizenship of their parents, which is called jus sanguinis. So that child born in California will be a dual citizen, Hawaiian and American. Okay, so you had to possess the nationality of the Hawaiian Kingdom, as you would in any other country, right? Aliens don't vote in a country until they become a national, right? In the Hawaiian Kingdom, it was multi-ethnic, right? 84% of the national population were Aboriginal Hawaiians, both pure and part, okay? 16% were non-Aboriginal. So like people like Lauren Thurston, Sanford Dole, they weren't American, but they were Haole, right? That's just their ethnicity, but they were Hawaiian subjects. In fact, Lauren Thurston's grandfather, Asa Thurston, who was the first missionary party that came, he gave up his American citizenship and he became naturalized. Now that says a lot. These Americans gave up their citizenship to become Hawaiians. Wait a minute, I thought they came here to take over. Well, they gave it up, right? So this presentation was in hopes of introducing a different way of thinking of the Hawaiian Kingdom. But Kristen has put in the resource section a particular chapter 1 of my book, Royal Commission of Inquiry. I encourage everyone to read that chapter, and it gets into the real details of Hawaiian constitutional governance, where if we weren't able to ask a question at this time, hopefully the answers to your questions can be found when you read the resources.
All over sharing that with us, Dr. Sai. I saw also Kristen putting more resources in the chat, and we'll make sure to get that to everyone. Well, let me invite Linda on to kind of close us, and we'll look forward to another presentation from you next week. So mahalo, Dr. Sai.
Thank you.
Mahalo again to Dr. Sai and to Cassie for moderating the questions. I want to acknowledge Kristen Young, who is behind the scenes, really making sure that all of our technology works. So thank you so much for that. And also Kalani Akea Wilson, who was the champion for bringing this forward from the Justice and Witness Missional team, which Cassie is also a member of. So thank you for being with us, and we hope you'll join us again next week for the third of Dr. Sai's presentation. Aloha.